Thank you all for joining us this morning. This is our first session for Archives Month, which we're holding in October. It's to promote archival awareness. Sorry, my notes just disappeared. 1 second. Okay. We would love to have you all join us for any or all of our other sessions as well. So tomorrow's session is digital preservation and the future of archives. Next Monday is Bahamian history, preserving our cultural memory. And Wednesday, the 26th, is climate change impact on libraries and archives with a focus on the Caribbean and the Bahamas. All sessions are at 10 a.m. and are hybrid. So in-person attendees will be in the Harry Seymour Library Auditorium. And there's also a Zoom registration link for each session for those who wish to join virtually. The session today is Archives 101. And for this session, we'll be focusing on an introduction on archives, what they are, what they do or strive to do, and why they are important. I've left some time at the end for questions, but if any come up as we're going, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will address them at the end. Bear with me as I try and advance my slide. Okay, so I wanted to start off today's session by quickly introducing myself. My name is Juliana Milburn, and I'm the University Archivist here at UB. Just a bit of my background. I have my Master's of Library and Information Science with a focus on archives and records management from the University of Denver. I have been in the field for about 10 years, first working in digitization while I was a student, both in undergrad and grad school. And I have a digital archive specialist certification. I joined UB in January of this year after 6 years working in geospatial engineering services at the University of Virginia. I was first a records management specialist slash archivist there, and then a document compliance analyst. So I think it's helpful to start with a definition first. So an archives is an institution's or individual's entire preserved body of interrelated and interdependent records, or AFONs. So archives or archived material have intellectual control exhibited over them, which means that it's been organized and described to an extent and is easily retrievable. So a good visualization of intellectual control is to think of a filing system with clear labels versus just a junk drawer. So while the term archive or archiving is widely used in email and web platforms, it's actually being used incorrectly by a lot of those. They're using that archive folder on those platforms as kind of like a limbo of, I don't want to permanently delete it because I think I might need it later. So I'm just going to stash it here so it's not in my inbox. No real intellectual control is being taken in that instance. So it's technically incorrect to call it an archive or think that you're archiving material in the manner that information professionals mean the term. So here's a list of a few types of archives. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list, but these are some of, I guess, your top 10 or top however many I actually put on here. So institutional archives are archives that are usually housed within a single institution. They will preserve and record all of the materials of that institution. So UB Archives is technically an institutional archives, although we do some collecting as well, but institutional archives can be any company's archives. So like the Walt Disney Company has their own, which is a fun example. And then government agency archives. So most government agencies, either departments, parties, what have you, anything that falls under that umbrella, they usually have their own archives. And then there's also usually, they feed into a national archives or anything that's set up that way. Community archives are kind of like what they sound like. So it can be a community that's grouped together by like they can either be neighborhoods or mission driven, and it's the people generally in community archives, it's generally the people who are creating content who are also directly involved in collecting, describing, and all of that. And they're usually smaller archives. They don't have to be though. Activist archives are again like kind of what they sound like. So they generally have a mission, an activist mission, and they're collecting material directly from their activist mission. So there's climate change activist groups that have their own archives, LGBTQ, any kind of like issue that they're taking active measures on, they can have their own archives. Collecting archives are archives that are seeking to have new accessions, which is not true sometimes of all archives, or can be differently true for institutional archives, because usually they are accessioning just new records as the institution delivers them. But collecting archives can also seek not just whatever institution they're housed within, but they can seek other material. And then museum archives, of course, are kind of, again, could be considered an institutional archive. There's a lot of crossover in these different types, but they're generally housed within the museum or at an offsite building and have to do with all of the museum activities. They also can have different materials. They might have a bunch of different mixed medias, or it might be actually archiving what materials were put on for different exhibitions and whatnot. And then trusted digital repositories are a type of archives which are put through an audit, and they have passed several checklists of the audit to establish as a trusted digital repository. And this is where you can put your digital objects and be assured that correct digital preservation practices are being taken with them. So next is the mission of archives. So every archive's mission contains a form of these following actions. So if you're ever bored and really love to read archives mission statements, which I'm sure all of you love to do, they will all have some form of saying that they appraise, collect, describe, preserve, and provide access. So the first, appraise. So archival appraisal is when an archivist assesses material to see if it meets criteria to be accessioned into the collection or collections. So we use appraisal, but it's not appraisal like many think of it. We do not assign dollar values to materials. We are simply appraising it to see if it can be accessioned into the archives. So records are evaluated by kind of two main things. So the first is that they are fixed, unique, and authentic. So there's a difference in authenticity and truth. So there are a lot of records that are authentic, but not necessarily true. So examples can be records of espionage, satire, propaganda, that type of stuff. So while it is authentic, it may not be true. So that's a difference to draw there. And then the second way that records are evaluated is if they meet the collection policy or the scope of the archives in question. So it's not possible to save everything, and not everything should be saved, because if you save everything, you essentially have nothing. So appraisal is vital to making sure that you not only identify material to collect, but also make sure that once an archives takes custody of that material, that they have the resources necessary to properly maintain it. So collection of materials after appraisal is a process that includes taking intellectual, physical, and legal custody over the materials. So this is often achieved through a deed of gift or a donor agreement and an accession record. And the two of those together are like a very happy marriage of information. So a deed of gift or a donor agreement also usually lays out if there's any use restrictions. It can help give background on the creator of the records and maybe like where they lived their life and any iterations of them. And it can also provide if disposition of those records needs to happen. So if just through normal processes of an archives, maybe changing its mission or reevaluating things that were taken in, disposition does happen, or if, you know, heaven forbid, an archives has to close and they're going to try and see where different records would be, and some of them are disposition in a deed of gift or a donor agreement. It can also lay out what the donor's wishes are on those materials. So if they need to be returned to them, and how much effort needs to be made to try and make contact, because as you can imagine, if 30 some years have gone by, it's harder to get in contact with people, especially pre-email. And so it lines out each person's, both the archives and the donors, kind of like what their responsibilities are in this, and transfers legal custody over to the archives, which is very helpful. And then an accession record is an archive's own internal information. So that'll be identifying it, saying the extent of what we're collecting. So it'll detail out, you know, if it's 3 boxes of just print materials, if there's any kind of different media in their hard drives, external drives, CDs, any of that. So then describing is really a way to create organization both within the archives for internal people who are working with the archives, and creating those points of access for users. So having a good accession record and doing that part feeds directly into being able to describe really well. So finding aids are the standard template that archives use to describe what are in different collections. And all of those finding aids are different metadata points that are essentially creating those points of access for users. So those metadata become search terms that users can use in order to look to see if anything in your collection serves any of their research purposes. It also, if you follow, there's all kinds of standards with finding aids that allow it to be marked up to HTML or EAD and those types of codings that allow it to be machine readable. So that helps with obviously searching on a computer, which we're all very used to now. So you're not having to thumb through physical copies of finding aids. This increases, like good description increases visibility, so both of the archives and of your holdings. And then there are also differences in descriptions or metadata schemas like premise that allow you as an archivist or someone working in an archives to record what actions you've actually taken with the materials. So with premise, that helps with preservation metadata. So if you've done certain steps to help preserve it, or you're trying to establish fixity of digital files, that's helpful. So preservation now is minimizing chemical and physical deterioration and damage. So all organic materials deteriorate. They have different rates that they deteriorate at, and it's just important to keep those in mind and be aware. So 3 aspects of preservation are that it involves resources, it's an active process, and there is intellectual control involved. So successful preservation is a living process and requires resources to be dedicated to it. So that can be physical housing, environmental controls or monitoring, access controls, and documentation. It requires time and money to be able to do well. Items may also be digitized as a form of preservation if they meet certain criteria. And then digital preservation, best standards and stewardships comes into play, which is the focus of tomorrow's session. Just a little plug in case you're interested in that route. And then the last one, providing access. So it's important to know that access does not mean like a blanket statement of everyone should be able to have the same levels of access, especially if it's an institutional archive or a governmental agency. So access does not mean that everything has to be a free-for-all. Access can mean that certain things are not just freely accessible, or they're only accessible to certain roles, but that there is transparency in policies. That's where it becomes really important. So if you don't have necessarily like equal access to things because maybe you have protected materials or someone's not, a member of the institution that you're collecting for, it's important for you to have transparency in your policies. Reading rooms are also a point of access. So like a lot of archives that may not have a digital presence, or they may have their first requirement for access is you to physically come into the building. So reading rooms are historically and currently still where a lot of archival research is held. A lot of places are moving towards a digital access management system. So they'll have all of their digital objects, or maybe just digitized materials available through a management system. That also leads to web exhibitions. So that is popular for being able to show off what resources you have by having a web exhibition where people can maybe research there, or at least it gets you out in front of people and can increase their awareness. And then one of the most important things about access and about missions of archives is that there has to be longevity to the access. So there has to be some kind of plan to where access can occur through perpetuity. So briefly, very brief archival history. Archives generally, like as a codified kind of role or career, have been thought to start with church officials. Churches were generally the first like good examples of record keepers, especially in places where church basically ran everything and government was kind of a branch of the church. So obviously with that, there was not wide access to everyone, and there wasn't transparency the way that we think of it now. It's basically if you were a church official, you had access to the records that you needed. So that is where kind of the archives profession originated in. So these terms on the screen are like the big fancy archives words that you might hear. So first, provenance. That means the original source of something. So it's essentially the creator or creators of materials. An original order is how that creator or creators had the work organized. So the two of these come together to make respect défense, which is the overarching principle that combines these two, which is to say, like, you should try to keep together archives and material by creator or source. So you shouldn't split materials that are under a creator. So challenges of archival theory, there are many, but essentially one of the big ones is the challenge with any theory is bringing that theory into the real world. So theories exist to give us kind of like this wonderful utopia of how the work should be done and provide a great framework. And then there are certain things that just don't hold up once you're putting it into real life experiences. So a lot of the challenges have to do with the fact that the importance of the item or creator can be really unknown. So there are a lot of people who they become notable after death or tons of years after their death. And then all of a sudden, because of who they are, their materials have more importance than they did when they're alive. And you can't predict things like that necessarily. And then the archives. Another challenge is lack of detail. So if you're getting materials that you maybe don't know who created them, you don't know what order they were in because someone else threw them all into a box, which can lead to assumption of original order. So sometimes you get materials and you may assume that they're in original order, but they definitely are not, and they're not how the creator would have had them. There can also be instances of multiple provenance or like unclear provenance, especially when you're getting into like kind of group projects or things that people worked on. It's like who had what piece and what is it attributed to. You can also have instances where the creator is very established, so you know exactly who created the records, but they're about a different group as the subject. So if someone, there are government documents that are about farming, but they are not written by farmers is a great example. So that may be a point where your provenance is very clear. It's very clearly from this agency, but it needs contextual information provided to your users to maybe say like, hey, there's a missing perspective here. And that is just to say that there are biases. So there are biases from record creators. There are biases from describers. So colonizers describing indigenous records is a huge problem. And there has been just a current trend towards having indigenous communities go back and make task forces to try and describe their records that have been described by a colonizer, because obviously they become known by the language of the colonizer, which can be pretty problematic and be missing a lot of information. So this is an infographic that I created about so like applying the theory. So after theory comes actual processing. So there's physical processing, which is physically touching the paper, removing staples, removing tape, like trying to minimize essentially everything that you can for preservation, because obviously we know very well in the Bahamas, but like anything that's metal is going to rust. So you want to remove all of that from the paper because that will make a chemical difference in your paper. And then there's also intellectual processing. So having the collection and figuring out where it fits into the materials that you already have. So just like the hierarchy of your actual archives. So this infographic is archival description, but it also helps you know like how they're described. So first is the fonts or collection, depending on where you are in the world, they're used interchangeably. So the fonts though is kind of like the whole thing. And then there can also be people who refer to fonts as different collections as part of the whole thing. So it has like two different definitions at the same time, which is super confusing. But that's as a whole. And then it's built in, broken down into series. And when within those series, like the series titles are usually similarities between the records. So meeting minutes might be a good series that you have. And then within a series, if it's needed, you can have different sub-series as well. And then after series, it's broken into files. So like a group of documents that are generally usually in a folder together, like in an actual file folder, and then the actual items within that folder. So the use of archives, there's kind of three big ones. So they record history. So archives can be helpful for a glance of historic facts or like what happened or maybe how different people felt about it. Archives also can provide accountability or be a measure of accountability. So if someone is trying to say that something did or did not happen, obviously archives can provide evidence of what actually went down, and just the fact of that existing also can provide accountability. So the fact that this information is going to be stored and is able to be accessed later can be a measure of accountability. And then they record memory. So they are the holders of collective and personal memory. They can be a place where you are able to explore maybe missed memories, or they can take into account and take memory and make it part of history, which makes history richer. That goes into the significance of archives. So the quotation on the slide is from the International Council on Archives, which is an international professional organization within the archives community. So archives are witnesses to the past. They provide evidence, explanation, and justification both for past actions and current decisions. So archives have a profound effect on the human condition and shaping understanding of the world. So the documentation of past memory and actions does not only fulfill research needs of contextualizing what was done, why, and how, but it also serves as a connection to collective and personal history. There's a reason why history being lost, either through purposeful means sometimes or not, causes immense ripple effects in societies for years to come. So loss of information and knowledge erodes the functioning of those societies. This erosion can exist on many different levels, from an agency losing an employee who had institutional knowledge necessary to perform a role that someone new was not trained in, and maybe it wasn't recorded because it was stuff that they just knew from being in the job. It can be a logistical standpoint of needing to manage the aftermath of a natural disaster or any kind of similar thing that realigns priorities within what you're able to do in your work. And sometimes the loss of information erodes so deep that entire perspectives or histories are not able to be recovered. So archives provide a means of front lines to defend against the loss of memory and carry it through so the information is able to be accessed and used now and for future generations. So do we have any questions?
So when you mentioned about the narrative of certain archives being problematic, and persons who of the communities who are subject to those archives, getting them now to reinterpret the narrative or to expand on the narrative. How does that actually happen? What's the logistics of something like that?
Okay, so for anyone who didn't hear that, it's a question about the logistics of having people help change the narrative of their own records where someone else has been describing them. So especially like if the colonizer has been describing Indigenous communities' records. So the logistics of it, unfortunately, are very complicated because of generally the relationship that has happened for a long time, especially if you're thinking of a colonizing nation and how they've described records of their colonized. So it's first, the problem is a lot of times, like, what records do they actually keep? Because a lot of times colonizers did not see the value in keeping the records of that. So there's a lot missing, first of all. But then for what is not missing, and they have described, there are several work groups that are working through the logistics of trying to invite those communities back into the discussion. And unfortunately, with a lot of it, they're met with very mixed reactions. So for a lot of them, it's hard for them to trust that this is a process that's actually going to go someplace, or that like they should dedicate their time to, or maybe they don't have the time to dedicate to it. I know also with like in the US with Indigenous communities, so like Native Americans who have been invited back to describe some of their records. There's also like a matter of safety to consider in the fact that a lot of the terms that they would use to describe things are deeply significant to their culture. And so those would not be things that they want to just have like widely accessible to everyone, because it may document some kind of religious practice or something like that that could be appropriated and maybe not be like a complete safe place for them to just like have all of that knowledge out there. And then in a lot of times, I think it might be hard to identify people who are able to actually come in and help redescribe. There's obviously not a large amount of BIPOC compared to like white Western archivists, like in our frame of the world. So like there also aren't as many people who are professionally trained who are going into that. So yeah, it's a logistical conundrum a bit, but there are working groups that are trying very hard to responsibly invite members back in to describe. And there's also thoughts on just repatriating items. So if institutions should actually be keeping them, or if they should be offered back to the communities whose records they actually are.
I have a thought on it as well. I think that even though the language can be problematic, I think sometimes you need to preserve that so people don't forget the mentality
Right.
that was had. Because like if we start to do this, you know, one of the popular trends of today is cancel culture. So if we don't like something or something offends someone, you know, let's erase that. Let's not say that, you know, like, you know, whatever. Now, obviously, you can't say certain things anymore because you know that it's something that really is not helpful and is disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. But if you erase that from history, then you really are you're not able then to understand what people went through at that time and maybe still might be going through now as a result of this action, you know, like with the colonizing and different things like that. So it really makes it even more complex because you would need to have now, you will have two parallel narratives because you can't get rid of the original. Because if you get rid of the original, you actually now denying the things that happened.
Mm-hmm.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I understand the need to actually get a fuller perspective of the records, but I don't think it is useful to redact the original language. I think it might be useful to have a parallel narrative along with it. So if you have, okay, say you have a statue,
Mm-hmm.
like how like last year they had a statue that was removed from a public place in I think it was South Carolina.
It's been all over the US, yeah.
But they removed it or they defaced it and all that. But what they didn't consider is the fact that you still need to keep the history. you still need to know that this person, despite being a slave owner or whatever, historical event that they, did. Now, they don't have, you're not having any record of that. So people don't know the full story. You see what I'm saying? Because like before, maybe this particular statue was to honor them for something that they did that was beneficial to society or whatever, right? Okay. But it wasn't showing the full story before, and it definitely isn't now because it's not there. So even if you have the parallel narrative to say that, all right, this person was a benefactor and did this, maybe built a library, built a university, whatever, through the profits of their plantation. You see what I'm saying? And so you could have parallel narratives going on so that it would honor the truth. I think that's the most important thing. You need to have the truth about it. Could be good, bad, or ugly. You need to have it.
So a lot, I mean, as far as statues, I feel like that's different because most of them in the South were put up during the Jim Crow era. It's actually not recording true history.
Okay.
It's recording people being very prejudiced and racist. It's yeah. But as far as reevaluating and adding in language and recontextualizing some things in archives, it's slowly gaining traction to be a wider practice. And it's one that I enjoy, where you are actually providing information on who is filling out the information in a finding aid and like details about that human behind this information, so that you're not just seeing, I mean, like I'll use us for an example, like, you know, the letterhead, like UB Archives, like it is this, you know, there's an actual human element behind that of recording that. And in instances, especially in institutions that were involved in not great practices, involved in eugenics maybe and stuff like that, I think it's an important practice to go back and reevaluate, but also moving forward to provide some information of who's giving you this information that maybe falls under an institution's look, or like what is happening. So with a lot of them that they're redoing, they're not fully erasing the old terms. They're actually like adding a note that like, hey, this is a problematic term or a not true term, or this is not in the native language. Here is the native language term.
I agree.
Yeah. Because that is important. To not just, especially like with ugly parts of history, like the ugly parts are how we would hopefully learn. So it's important with those.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us. If we don't have anything else, let me check the chat really quick. I don't think so. All right. Wonderful. Oh, do we have another question maybe?
Hi, Jay.
Hi.
Good job. Good job.
Oh, thank you. My favorite kind of question.
I think Felicia's question can also lend itself to the importance of research, because like you say, the documents are up to interpretation. So if you have changes that you can look at and compare what people are saying at any particular time, it tends to add value to that collection. So it's not a matter of changing the history of it. This is what existed. And now the researcher has the tool to do further investigations and, you know, come up with new knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's always, I think that's why finding aids, especially like as a template, are such a gold standard and have lasted, is because it's not over contextualizing or telling a researcher exactly what they need to think or feel about it. It's more presenting the records. So I definitely agree, because you never want to lead someone who's researching to one conclusion with your materials.
Definitely. Now, your presentation spoke widely to the archives. Is there a component that would perhaps focus on archives within the academy?
Like within here?
Yeah, within academic libraries, because archives, like you say, the history of where it started. But what is the relationship to the archives within the institution? Your historical presentation, spoke about the church and the other things. But we're trying to see how we can connect all of that history to what currently exists within our context.
Right. So archives like ours that are within a university, they're kind of like a hybrid between institutional and collecting archives. But institutional archives are definitely focused on recording decisions or actions that an institution has undergone, and those serve to inform like what past actions have been done and why, and provide that kind of data for research, as well as continue to be able to give that information to inform processes. And then with something like this, that's kind of like a hybrid, especially in a place like the Bahamas, where it's relatively despite having lots of islands, it's relatively small as a country. And so this is a great outlet to also be able to collect different materials and preserve like Bahamian like memory as well, or any kind of information on notable events or people in history.
Thank you, Jay. It sounds like we got a lot of work ahead of us.
Job security is what I call it.
Okay, thanks, girl.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much for everyone joining us. Let's see if I can find you. There we go.